Greetings, listeners, and welcome to On the Spectrum podcast, a show that explores the many complexities and diversities of being on the spectrum. I am your host, David, and joining me today is Rachel Wright. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, David.
It's no problem at all. Thank you. Would you like to start by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself and about what it was like, your journey through being a mother with a child with learning disabilities?
So my name is Rachel and I am a qualified nurse. So my background is in nursing, but I am now the founder and director of Born at the Right Time, which is an organisation set up for helping bridge the gap between families like mine and the many practitioners who support us across social care, SEN and healthcare. And I started up that organisation because, like you say, I am the parent of somebody with complex learning disabilities. So I became a mother 19 years ago now. I know I look far too young for that, which is just as well. This is an audio affair, so you can't tell whether that's true or not. But I became the parent of Sam, and he has complex learning disabilities and medical complexities, and his birth was quite traumatic. And he was diagnosed with severe brain damage when he was about 10 weeks old. And then I was thrust into this other world of being on the other side of the bed. And I realised at that point how different my life was and how our experience of services and how the relationship with practitioners was when people communicated with us better and listened and collaborated and paid attention to what was mattered to us. So that's I ended up writing a book about 10 years ago now, a memoir, The Skies I'm Under. And from that, I started speaking at conferences. I started delivering training. And now we have a whole host of training programs around communicating and working with families better that holds both sides of the divide, so to speak, both the lived experience of the families and the context and the experience of the practitioners as well. So I have 3 more sons now. So I have my 17-year-old is neurodivergent. My 9-year-old is about to go through a process of diagnoses potentially for autism, and I also have a 2-year-old who's recently become part of our family because of bereavement. So a very complex mix. And another sort of member of the family joined us. So I have a 24-year-old daughter who joined us only 4 years ago. So she joined us in the pandemic and started off as a carer for my son, has very much become one of the family as well. So very our family edges are very blurred.
Right. Okay, that's very open, and yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. I share your experience as well. I've been working with children with autism for 10 years, and my son has been diagnosed with autism. So like yourself, I'm starting to see the other side of the coin, so to speak, when it comes to the professional and the personal. And I think it's great what you're doing, trying to bridge that gap, because I always advocated that sometimes, parents need a bit more clarity with what's going on in the professional world and need to be kept up to date. So I think it's a very, it's a very important thing that I think you're pursuing.
Yeah, sometimes it's not even the amount of information, it's the attitude and the culture of the practitioners and the organisation, and how easy the systems make it to work with practitioners. You know, if you're a parent and it gets to making an appointment and you've had to jump through 3 hurdles and you got a letter and then you had to make a phone call, and then that phone call took you to an automated service that referred you back to a website that then had a link that, do you mean by the time you actually get to that, you are frustrated, you are, armored up and ready to kind of wrestle that practitioner into doing exactly what you want, and it's the systems that have set that up. It's not even the person you're sitting in front of. So it's not just the interface of the practitioner-parent relationship, but it's also the context within which both those people are working, and whether it sets that conversation up to be successful or whether it sets it up to be adversarial and full of conflict and second guessing each other. And
Yeah, that makes sense now, because I'm, like I said, I've been in the industry for a long time, but now I'm starting to get context as to why some parents may have been acting the way they were acting, why some professionals were acting the way they're acting, because, like you said, they had to go through all these hurdles. And I myself, just to get my son's EHCP ready, have I've gone through a lot of a lot of different professionals, and sometimes they're hard to set up, and there's scheduling conflicts, and you're waiting to hear back from people, and it does get very, very frustrating. So is this like your sort of your main focus, is to try and make that kind of process a little bit more friendly and a little bit more personalized?
Yeah, so our business has three main strands. So it's supporting the parent carers directly. So we also have a podcast. We've got a podcast, The Skies We're Under, which is probably slightly more sweary and ranty than yours. But has...
Yeah, we just want to listen to it. Yeah, we like...
Yeah. So it has predominantly me and two co-hosts, all of whom are parents of people with complex disabilities and who are also practitioners. So one is an assistant educational psychologist. The other is a CEO of an equipment provider for postural care. And then myself, a nurse. And we sort of talk about that dual experience of parent and practitioners, and lots of the different... And then we have different people in interviewing. So we have the podcast, we've got my book, I'm online and social media, doing blogs, just trying to help parents feel connected, like that, giving people resources and insights, useful, if I've seen research or whatever, I summarize it and put it on social media and things like that, just trying to equip parent carers. And then the training and development for practitioners, which is all around using that lived experience and peeling back the layers of that lived experience. So not simply telling a family story, and we have a whole host of family stories to make sure that we have that cultural diversity and the diversity of experience expressed in our stories, but ensuring that we look at those stories and then peel back the layers and think, what's the undercurrent of that story that's going to impact relationship, going to impact collaborative working. And it might be the complexity of emotions. It's the complexity of the network of system that parents are required to work within. It's the lack of knowledge, like the fear of the unknown, of the sort of, there's a term I use called the vulnerability labyrinth, where as parent carers, we can feel lost and isolated because we don't understand the language and we don't understand the rules and we don't know who to go to when there is an issue. And if we do, then that person, we might understand the legislation, we might know what our rights are, but the way it's delivered doesn't seem to match that legislation, and then we find ourselves in this gap. So we try and give both sides of the story. We try to then look at what's the research, what's the evidence, what's the psychology, the sociology of living with disabilities in the UK and around the world at this time, that gives us an understanding. And using those two things, we then help people reflect and act upon what might be small changes, usually, that can make a big difference. Because sometimes it's simply a smile. Sometimes it's a letter that says, here's a link for you to book an appointment at a time that suits you. Sometimes it's using a person's name and not just simply saying mum or dad, and letting them letting your language show that you are partnering and proactively.
I read that on your website, wasn't it? On your website, there was a page where it's like, "Don't call me mum." Do you want to elaborate on that?
So the research says that I am amongst between 50% and 88% of parents who get absolutely riled by being called mum in a situation. Now, if I'm in an acute situation where, like, my son's having an x-ray, I'm going to see the radiographer for 15 minutes, you can call me anything. Like, I'm not going to see you ever again. It really doesn't matter. But for parents like us, we end up having very long-term relationships with practitioners because it's your see the OT on and off for years and years, the physio, the dietitian, the speech and language therapist, the educational psychologist, the health visitor, the school nurse. There's lots of people who we see repeatedly, and it can feel... I was in a scenario. There's two clear scenarios that sort of spring to mind when I think about this. One was I was at the school having an appointment for my son's hoist slings. So he is unable to move himself at all. So he has to be hoisted from his wheelchair onto any kind of surface. And so we were having the rep, and I heard the OT, who I've known for many years. We've emailed, we've phoned, we've had dozens of conversations. And she looked to the advisor for the company, and she went, well, Mum thinks that blah, 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 blah. And they had this little conversation between the two of them. And I was like, looking around the room, I was like, someone's mother turned up, because I'm not your mum. You didn't come out of me. I'm an equal expert in this conversation, if not more so, because I understand the context of my son. I understand the context of our home. I understand what I want for him, this sling to do. So a little bit of courtesy of just using my name, especially when you know it. The other time it was in the middle of the night, and I was lying on a beautiful fold-out bed in Great Ormond Street Hospital next to my son, who'd just had an operation for his hips. And in the darkness, I heard this, Mom. And I thought, oh my goodness, they've not just fixed his hips, they've made him verbal as well, because my son isn't verbal. But no, it's one of the nurses were waking me up in the middle of the night by calling Mum. And I was like, yes, son, to the male nurse who walked in. It just felt bizarre. It felt weird. It was no reason for it. My name to him is not Mum. So that annoys me. Partly because it's paternalistic. It's feels kind of dismissive. And the times when practitioners have said, they start the conversation, they say, hi, my name is, and then they respond, they continue that, because only half the conversation, they then respond with, and your name is, what would you like to call me? And then they use my name scribbled on a piece of paper, even if they've forgotten, and they say, sorry, I've forgotten your name. What is it again? That's absolutely fine. But suddenly I feel like a partner in that conversation. Suddenly I feel like we are both people first. We both have names, and then we have a job. We have a role. We have an expertise, whether it's the OT, the physio, the teacher, the specialist nurse, the whatever it is, and the parent. And we all come with that expertise. And it's together that we collaborate and make the best decision for the child or young person that we're discussing. So it's just a little way that people can work towards showing their willingness and their aspiration to partner with parents simply by using our names.
Yeah, certainly, and you won't feel more like the labyrinth like you described earlier. You won't feel so like alone and like because it's been more personal. I see that. Yeah.
Yeah, in a sea of jargon, of policies, of procedures. When somebody uses your name, you kind of land back in your body again. I always get really put off, when the insurance company calls or you phone up to get a new quote for the car insurance, and they just, go through all the security and that. And then at the end of the conversation, you've had this very boring 15-minute conversation where you're trying to persuade them you don't want your costs to go up by however much. And then they go, is there anything else you'd like, Rachel? And I'm like, oh, yes, they do know my name. Of course they do. It's written on a piece of paper or on a computer screen in front of them. And it kind of disarms you a little bit, because there's a vulnerability, there's a connection in that, isn't there? And you've never met that person, but that connection is really meaningful when you are trying to discuss. And like we said right at the very beginning of this conversation, that sort of potential tension, that potential hypervigilance, being armored up, again, is dissipated slightly by saying, you're a person that I recognize with all your own little baggage and ideas and preferences, and I am a person, and we're going to try and work this out together by being open and honest and working things through. So I think it's a very small way that we can make a big difference in the ways that we work and communicate with each other.
No, certainly, because what you're dealing with, like you said, can be quite complex issues. I remember we had some parents on the podcast before that used to say they had a little sort of company for their son, and the father would take care of this business, the mother would take care of this business, and whatever their strengths were, they would have to collaborate to sort of navigate through. I like the word labyrinth because it does seem like that sometimes.
It feels like the systems, and you kind of get used to one system and you get used to one person, and then that job, it can be that the ICBs gone from being the CCG and the system's completely different to how you did get funding for a certain thing, or it might be that practitioner that you got to know really, really well has changed, gone on maternity leave, been promoted, no one's taking their place, not quite sure. Like there's so many moving parts to that labyrinth that makes it way more Harry Potter-esque than is entirely necessary.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, professionals do sort of move on and do other things. And I always say that, we're always advocating for, having a good relationship to help the child with autism, but also having a good relationship to move things forward in these complex situations is also important.
Absolutely, because the relationship, we have the potential to bring the best out in each other, and we have the potential to bring the worst out in each other. And we have so limited time, energy, resources that we need to be efficient and effective with our time, energy, and resources. And if we are not bringing the best out of each other because of misunderstandings, because of lack of clarity, because we haven't connected in a meaningful and optimistic way, then it's nobody. The person who's losing the most is the young person, the child that we're trying to support, and it's essentially wasteful. We can work more effectively together if we listen, if we pay attention, if we listen to understand, not just say our point of view more vigorously and more correct to make the other person persuaded to your viewpoint. But yeah, I think we can. There's lots to be done still.
Just going off of some of the questions I've got here from my colleague, we're just asking about, are there any particular misconceptions about parenting a child with learning disabilities that you wish people understood more?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that we're a different breed. So, and I kind of feel like this, and I've seen it in the literature, and I've seen it in practitioner colleagues. It's like, so if you see a parent of a 10-year-old walking down the street, and they were to fall over and break their leg, and they needed intervention and they needed support, there would be a kind of I think there is something where everybody can sort of relate to that. Everyone can relate to that sudden something changes, that inconvenience, that pain, that fear, that worry, that whatever. And practitioners in accident emergency, practitioners in the hospital and pediatrics departments, in the school, in different places will be like, I can understand what that must be like to be wandering in the street and then suddenly something changes. But I think when you have a young person with a learning disability, it's unconscious bias, I think, but I think there is a misconception that we were somehow set apart and different. And I wonder whether, speaking to many parents on the podcast, speaking to practitioners, that is in part because we just don't think things like that are going to happen to us. We don't think our family is going to be one of those families. I was reading a memoir of an ITU consultant who talked about her work as an ITU consultant over in America, and she sort of said when she herself then had a child with a learning disability, she realised the bias that she had held and how she had distinguished the difference between the families who had a sudden accident and those families who were living in more chronic, long-term, complex medical situations because of learning disabilities or chronic health conditions. And that she realised that bias was on her part because that mum was still the same kind of mum, but she had siphoned them off as a different type of family to all the other families where there had been a sudden traumatic event. But actually, all of us started off pretty much on this parenting journey with an expectation of what life would be like. And no one really matches that expectation. Like, none of us get to experience the rose-tinted version that we'd imagined for ourselves. And some of us go more off-piste than others. But we are changed by that situation, but I I think people, I think there's a misconception that we were always different, and we're not. We're just the same as everybody else.
No, fair enough. And what you're saying there is something that I'm feeling. I had certain expectations for my boy, and when they're not met, like you said, it does affect you, and you have to sort of try and change your mindset. Was it like that for you with your children? Did you have certain things that you wanted, certain aspirations for them, that you had to sort of alter in a way?
Yeah, and it was very dramatic with my eldest son. In that he was born and he nearly didn't survive the first couple of days. He was very, very unwell. And then he did survive, and he was discharged after 12 days, which was a very short time in SCBU, which is probably partly, my husband's a GP, I'm a nurse. We probably kind of got out of there faster than most. But we then had his MRI scan at 10 weeks, and that's when the consultant told us that he had severe brain damage, and that rather than saying that no, kind of, he's not going to walk, he's not going to talk, he's not going to do any number of things, she made it very, very clear that none of those things could be assumed. Like, those milestones were not predictable markers in our future, in his future. And it was only then, on that quite dreary, cold journey home on the train, that I began to realise the extent to which I had imagined a life and a world for him. I think sometimes it's only when I talk about it in my memoir, it's as though the consultant had conjured up a paintbrush of dripping white emulsion and whitewashed what had once been a wall of hopes and dreams and aspirations, this colourful myriad of aspirations and a future, and it was just whitewashed. It was just, by her words, just took it all away, and what was left wasn't hopeful and expectant. It was just really daunting and fearful and overwhelming. So that was a very dramatic shift, and we had plans to live in different countries, and we'd had all sorts of things, and suddenly I didn't know if he was going to walk, and he was, within a year, he was diagnosed as being registered blind. And, he was, within 18 months, he was being fed via a tube in his stomach. And so there was really big, dramatic changes to our life. So when his brother came along 18 months later, I couldn't believe how quickly he developed and how easy everything was and how completely different it was. And I probably missed his neurodivergence for many, many years, because it just was, so comparatively felt very, very minor.
I was going to say, is it a comparison thing?
Yeah. Like the only parenting I knew was hardcore parenting.
Yeah.
With like Mission Impossible, clinging onto the cliff edge with your fingernails type, where I'm having to be a specialist OT at home and adapt with physiotherapy stuff and needing to blend diets and give medications 8-9 times during the day and drawing things up and, ordering syringes and liaising with clinics and doing emails and all these things. So the fact that my son, who's going through a potential diagnosis for ADHD at the age of 17, it was just frustrating that he wouldn't put his socks on. And I knew if he went into his bedroom with one instruction, he would inevitably I'd find him sitting on the floor reading a book. 30 seconds later, he could only get changed for school sitting on the stairs. That was the only place where there was no other distractions, but he was still getting dressed. Like, that was still progress. So I probably missed some of the ways that I could have supported him, because of that comparison. And he enjoys telling me that.
Does he? Okay, of course.
Full-fledged teenager.
It is a difficult thing, though. I think we miss some of our sons, because our son is pre-verbal now, but he was talking, and that was the bit that I found personally, what I found most challenging was the fact that he was talking, he was making, why has this all changed? And in the course of 6 months, it all kind of went away. So we were the same, and we were, thinking, we're doing the right steps. Everything seems to be going okay. He's talking now, he's doing this. And then the autism kind of came, and because I've worked with autistic kids, I knew long before the diagnosis what was going on, and so that process is difficult, and I think there's maybe elements of denial that happen, especially with family members and things where they're just sort of like, oh no, he's fine, he's just a quirky kid, or he's just themselves, So I think it's easily missed, and I think compared to what was going on with your first son, it sounds like it would have been easy to have missed that because you had to focus so much.
And my 17-year-old has totally got middle child syndrome, because then my third son, who's 9 and is so just gone into year 5, we've put more support in place for him, and his issues are slightly differently, and who knows where we'll end up. I'm sure there is a neurodivergence, but who knows how much of it is actually tied up with the trauma of having a sibling like their brother.
Yes, we've done a podcast on that, with a sibling relationship, and some of them felt like invisible child syndrome and things was something that came up about, we've got focused so much on them that they're kind of left to their own devices. And that was an interesting podcast as well, because it was nice to get the siblings' perspective, but it was also really heartwarming how much the siblings contribute to the support structure for the person with disabilities as well.
Yeah, and that we did a siblings episode, and interestingly, my 17-year-old didn't want to participate because he said, "I just feel like I don't do enough for my brother to warrant being part of it." And I think that was telling in themselves that there was this, he felt this pressure and expectation that he needed to be a certain type of person, and so it was really helpful for us to have that conversation and say it's not, there's no expectation on you to be some remarkable, wonderful, empathic sibling that does this, that, or the other. You are your brother's brother just by who you are, and there's no performance required. But you have to be really intentional to carve out time with all our children. It doesn't, and be really, and it was part of my intention and pursuit of getting support for us in the home and things to enable, which has its own complications, because then there's extra people in the house and you can't shout at your kids like you normally do, or not shout at when you can't.
I know what you mean. There's a loss of privacy.
Yeah, there is a massive loss of privacy when people are there the whole time. So I think there is a whole host of additional complexities for siblings. Yeah.
What changes or improvements would you like to see in the education and healthcare systems for children with learning disabilities?
What kind of changes? It would be really lovely. I know there's a consultation out at the minute for the SEND provision, and I would actually just really like for the SEND provision legislation to actually be enacted. I don't think even, there are ways that it could be improved, 100%. There are ways that more collaborative working, more aspirational, but actually, if it was delivered the way that the legislation, the white papers, the guidance describe it to be, where you're person focused, where you're needs based, where you're aspiration focused, where you're collaboratively looking at education, health and social care, when you're taking in the context of the whole family, all of this is written in our legislative guidance for SEND within the UK. If that was actually delivered, I think we'd be doing all right.
What do you think the barrier is to getting that stuff delivered? Do you think it's a staffing issue, people that haven't had the appropriate training? What do you think the barrier is to that?
I think the main barrier is we have an ideology that's not matched by our systems. So we have website rhetoric, we have government rhetoric, we have NHS legislation, we have guidance across SEN, which is motivated by ideology that is, nobody would really question, that person-centered, collaborative, listening to parents as experts, all this sort of stuff. Like, nobody out loud, at least, would argue with that. But we are trying to fit those aspirations into what is still largely a very didactic, paternalistic, capitalist, white patriarchal system that's about funding, that's about output measures and not outcome measures, that it's about what costs and what doesn't, and what's going to get the person to be most useful to society. Because if they're not useful to society and not being productive, then why are we bothering anyway? So that those attitudes have informed the development of our system for decades and longer, and we are still working within those systems. So we can't just have an idea of, but it would be nice if we listened to the lived experience of families, if we had them as experts. We have to change the system that enables those voices to be proactive partners. But at the minute, it's way more like consultation than co-production, because the practitioner has to come and say, well, what's your thoughts, what's your feelings, how do you think, then it goes to a panel of faceless typically white men who then make decisions based on output, based on outcomes, based on finances of the local authority. So I think there's fundamental underfunding. I think the systems are not in place to deliver it. So take the EHCP. So legally, you have a social care assessment as part of your educational health and care plan. That's in the legislation. They don't have to do anything about that assessment. They don't have to listen to it. They don't have to enact it. That's not part of the legislation, but they have to have an assessment. But still, we took 2 years to get an up-to-date assessment. Whenever my son it was quite a few years ago now, but when he was had it, and they were like, they offered the assessment, that's over 2 years old. We're not using that in this current EHCP. And they're like, well, this is all you're going to get. We're not going to do another assessment. I'm like, I've had a baby since then. I think our social context has changed slightly. But so I think the system just isn't in there. There's nobody who is responsible for it all. There's too much silo working where education's responsible for their little bits, health is responsible for their little bit, social care is responsible for their little bit. All of them have their individual funding stream, multiple funding streams within them. Yes. All the practitioners have different targets, have different output measures, key performance indicators, and none of the key performance indicators is how was the experience and the flow through of the person at the time, and whether their needs were met at a time that was appropriate to them. It's all practitioner focused. Sort of targets and things, and I think that's fundamentally one of the things that are going to trip us up and are going to continually trip us up in delivering a good system, because the infrastructure simply isn't there, and importantly, the accountability for the infrastructure to deliver the way it should do.
Because there's so many different bodies involved. Everyone's kind of working together, but in their separate zones. So who's the guy that's orchestrating everything?
And everybody just kicks the ball around. A fellow parent carer said to me once that it's like you're in this really bad game of pass the parcel and the music never stops. You feel like you are just constantly being pushed, and I think children with very complex needs can very often slip between that gap because they have very medical needs, and health have a level of responsibility, but they obviously also have social care needs. And so there's all these discussions, well, does this toilet chair need, is that a medical need or is it social care need? Because it's social for personal hygiene and stuff, but actually it's not if you then have to be hoisted into a specialist suitable toilet chair that is only from a specialist medical provider. So then you end up in that gap, and everybody avoids doing what the person needs because they are so concentrated on the little echo chamber of what their little bit of responsibility is perceived to be.
That's interesting, because now that you're highlighting it, I can see that is the case. A lot of people have their own zone of what they're supposed to do. And if something is slightly in the care sector or education sector or speech and language or what have you, it's like, well, you'll have to consult with them. And I think it creates a long delay because the process of getting my son's EHCP has taken a long time. I was told at the beginning of the process that it would take a long time, and we still haven't got all the bits together, you know. Exactly. I'm not saying that when I do get in the room with these professionals or via Teams or what have you, you know, I do feel like there's progress being done, but then I got to wait 2 weeks for the report, and you know, and you feel like you're kind of just, yeah, like you said, I like the idea that the music doesn't stop. Yeah, it feels a little bit like that. Yeah. What was so is this behind the motivations behind your book, Born at the Right Time?
So Born at the Right Time is my business, and I published the book under that. But the book is called The Skies I'm Under. So that's my story. Okay, so... And then the podcast is The Skies We're Under, so our collective stories. Do you see what I did there? See?
I see. Yes, very good. Cool. Yeah.
Okay. And Born at the Right Time is the business. Yeah.
That's the business. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I had it written down as you wrote it, but yes,
that's okay.
That's fine. So was that the motivation behind the book? What was you hoping to express and share with the world with your literacy?
My literacy, my grade C GCSE scraped in there. I had absolutely no intention of writing a book. In fact, I remember really clearly about 3 months after my son was born, or probably a few weeks after his diagnosis, I was standing by my sink and a friend washing some baby paraphernalia up, no doubt, and a friend was sitting at my dining room table, and I said, I'm never writing a book about this. If this is happening to me because there is some other idea that I'm going to be useful to other parents, it's not happening. I'm never doing it. Just absolutely not. Fast forward 10 years, and I couldn't, you know, I was doing the sort of wake up at 5 o'clock and all these scenarios, all these memories, all these conversations were rattling around in my head, and I couldn't get them out. And so I started writing them down, and I was still nursing at the time, but only 1 or 2 days a week. And I took myself off to a little writing course, and I wrote about my experience. And I just put time aside every week to get out. And it was very cathartic. It was really, really helpful. It was like its own kind of therapy.
Therapeutic, yeah.
Yeah, really therapeutic. And I wasn't thinking about other people reading it necessarily. And the person who did my writing course suggested that I started blogging. Didn't even know what a blog was. But then I started blogging just over 10 years ago. And got some traction from the blogs at different times. So that blog kind of carried on. And then I wrote the book. Didn't get it to an agent or whatever, but edited it and paid for some input and stuff, and then self-published it 10 years later. And I've written another subsequent book with my husband as well. So the aspiration, I then cut loads of stuff out that people really could not read. So there is another version of the book that's about a third longer that has the real juicy stuff in there.
They always say that every author writes more than is actually published.
Absolutely. Well, you also need to write.
You were doing it for therapeutic reasons as well. Yeah.
Exactly. I didn't. So I spent a year writing, and then I spent nearly 2 years editing to make it something that was potentially readable. And people from all around the world. It's on Kindle. It's on paperback. People are practitioners, families, parents who have said, my story is quite different, but I can really recognize, like, we don't have the attainment milestones of our children might be different, but actually the emotional milestones of our parenting can be very, very similar. So I think that comes across in the book.
Okay, great stuff. So moving on to impact of sharing your story. Sharing these personal stories publicly can be challenging. So what has it been like to open up about your family's journey in such a public way?
So I've probably evolved in my attitude towards, I suspect I would have written the book differently as myself than I did there. But you know, I was the person I was, and I wrote what I did. I share our story an awful lot, and I do find it emotional and emotive, but I have said it many times. And I think editing the book, I sat in those really dark places of the days after my son was born, and the days after his diagnosis, and the days after of me navigating, of being very fearful of our future. And so I sat in that place for a long time to edit it and to kind of really get to grips with what I was feeling and stuff. And so I think just that process took some of the sting out of those memories. But I do get tired. It is draining sharing our story again, but it is a fundamental part of our training. And it is a fundamental part of our business and our organisation that we have both sides of the bed, that we have that understanding of the parents' lived experience, the family's context, as well as the services, the systems practitioners' experience. And so, like I say, I've got some short videos. I pay for all of the stories that we record to ensure that we value parent-carer voices. And every time we use those videos in training, we pay the parent carers again, because it's fundamental to our training and development for services and for people that we have the voices and prioritise the perspective of families and parent carers, that we, like I said, look underneath the surface to really understand what's going on, and then we use that wisdom and that knowledge to be reflective about the practitioner, the systems that practitioner works in order to bring about change that is really meaningful and collaborative with families.
Do you find that when people share their stories that people kind of get a glimpse of what it's like to be in their shoes, and that affects their practice? Have you seen that? Have you seen that development in someone?
People have no idea. And why should they know? I mean, I had no idea. I did my learning disability training. I did my learning disability workplaces. I had no idea. And why should you? And but yeah, when I tell, and especially when I sort of peel back the layers, like the number of people that I have to communicate with about my son, the complexity of navigating the systems, the emotional gymnastics, the mental gymnastics of navigating how I'm feeling and how I'm advocating and what I need for myself and what I need for my son and all these things is tricky, is tiring, and I think I recognise the need to look after myself, whether I do that very well or not.
It is difficult sometimes. You kind of get into the zone of being the carer, so to speak, for lack of a better phrase. It's because, like I worked with autistic children for 10 years, but I always got to go home and space out for a little bit. And one of the things that I'm finding difficult is living with autism. Like you're saying, there's an emotional turmoil that's quite unexpected and almost gives you an insight as to what it's like to have it when you're surrounded by it constantly, and it could and it could impact your sleep, it can impact how your house looks, it can impact all these factors that I think in a professional light I kind of brushed over, and I didn't really think about these kind of things, that these little details, that I think it's little details that build up. And over time I've learned that yes, over time you have to do something to take care of yourself. It's interesting you say about writing, because I like to write fiction, and I find that very therapeutic as well, because when you're writing things down, you're externalizing some thoughts and sort of almost exercising your right to explore what that is and how you feel about it. So I think moments like that are very impactful, because I noticed if I didn't do that, the little things would build up, and eventually I'd get angry or I'd get frustrated. And then that's not the right thing for the child, I found, fundamentally, because they couldn't, he couldn't connect the dots as to why I was upset with him, Yeah. And like you said, I think there's this constant sort of balance with the home life as well, that my, decade-long experience working with autistic kids, it just wasn't there. It wasn't there until I was experiencing it firsthand.
Yeah, completely. There is a relentlessness, and that's a very heavy word, and that has very negative connotations, which is tricky when you're thinking about somebody that you love the most. Like, if it was a loved one with cancer, then we could all rile against cancer, but it's not something that's negative, inherently bad. The system within which we have to navigate is tiring and exhausting. The struggles that our loved ones have in understanding the world and being regulated and being happy is challenging. But the fact that I think one thing that practitioners don't realize is that the positive impact of a safe place like home. So no matter how stressed work is, they can choose to turn the laptop off and go home. And that home will have its own stresses. Of course it will. And it will have its own, but it'll be different stresses. But going home and that not feeling safe I don't mean that in a sort of safeguarding way. I just mean that in a restful way, in a switch off, kick your shoes off, sit back, put your feet up. When you are, in the micro level of thinking, how's my child coping? How are they regulating? What am I doing? What am I not doing? How are they needing support today? Have I remembered the medication? Have I remembered, all these details down to, is that EHCP letter email done? Do I need to chase that phone call yet? Have we sorted out that thing? Am I really going down the right path of how they're being supported, or should we be doing it in a different way? The kind of macro, the long-term decisions as well as the details are constantly there. Yes.
It's like a weight that's just there. And like you said, sometimes the day can be exhausting, and by the time you get around to doing these forms and these chasing up these emails and things, it's like 9-10 o'clock at night, and you're kind of burnt out, and then you're left wondering, did I do it right the next day? It's like, because I was tired, did it all go down right?
And now that I'm more tired and I don't feel quite regulated to actually engage with my child, I realize, I know this for a long time, but whether I actually act on it appropriately, I realize I only have one precious life. So not just my child's one precious life, but I only have one precious life. And I only have 24 hours a day, and I only have two hands. And therefore, if I'm choosing to do that form, and I'm choosing to go for that tribunal, or I'm choosing to pursue that complaint, that's at the expense of something else. Whether that is my mental health, whether that is going to the gym, whether that is having dinner with my husband, whether that is playing with my child, it all comes at an expense. And more I am trying really, really hard to measure up the benefit and outcome. There's issues at the minute with the provision my son has had. I know the local authority is not meeting their legal statutory duties, but do I want to fight it? If I choose to fight it, that is me taking myself away from something else. And I think it's really, really important as us parents to really decide, like the arguments with your kids, what's the battles you're going to choose? Like, what's the outcome of this going to be? Is this going to ultimately be, what's the cost benefit? Because I don't think we do that too often enough. I think we have too much cost to ourselves and to our families. And because what happens is you get to the end of the day and all the best of you has been spent on everybody else, and the people that you love get the dregs.
Yeah, that's interesting perspective. And you're often sort of, it's difficult to step back as well, because there's a lot of things that get prioritized in the moment, I find. And it's difficult to step back and be like, bigger picture, what is the most important thing?
Yeah, you end up in this little rabbit warren, don't you, of pursuing this thing because that's the next thing. And then sometimes it really takes energy and effort to step back and say, actually, in 5 years' time, this is going to be absolutely pointless. So how about we reserve? And that's why it's really important to do things like people's paths, that positive, or F words, or whatever you might want to do that collates what a person's good life looks like, or your family's good life looks like, so that you don't find yourself fighting for stuff or saying yes to stuff. Like, we could become nodding dogs to a system where we just say, yep, yeah, I'll be in that appointment. Yep, I'll do that. It's like, no, I'm not going to be in that appointment. I'm not going to drag my son out of school and traipse him across to London for that appointment that's going to last 30 minutes for you to do tick boxes. It's going to have no benefit for us whatsoever.
Right.
So I'm going to choose, I'm going to measure it up, because your needs might not be the same as mine, might not be the same as my son's.
So looking towards the future, what are your hopes and dreams for the future of Born at the Right Time? And are there any new projects or goals on the horizon?
Okay. My dream for Born at the Right Time is that we become the go-to provider for organisations across SEN, for social care, for healthcare, to understand, to learn, to lean into how people can collaboratively work with parents and carers of children with disabilities. Where our unique provision of looking at that lived experience, using that lived experience to inform, to look at the research, to look at the sociological and the psychological understanding and the context, to create real actionable changes to the way things are delivered, and to have real influence, to be an expert voice in some of those national policy making, so that we can prioritise. We're particularly passionate about those very complex children who are considered to be like 0.5% of the population, but can use up to like 10% of the paediatric healthcare budget alone, because of the level of their complexity. And then you add in SEN, and then you add in social care. So although there are very reasonably small, still 250,000 children, it's not, nothing to sniff at, but actually we have a very complex expenditure on the system, and the system is not working for us. It is not working. That silo working is amplified for families like ours. So I'd love to be part of changing that system. So we've got a whole host of new training and development programs coming out around. So we've got communication and collaboration training, personalised care training, conflict, how to deal with parent-carer complaints, how to deal with trauma. And there's very sadly lots of emerging research around the trauma that exists in parent-carers. And so we're delivering training on how organisations can be trauma-informed, not just for the children, but for the parent-carers who are having to navigate a really tricky system. So lots of new courses. You can check us out on the website www.bornattherighttime.com, and you can find all about us there.
That's great. Thank you very much. One last thing for the final thoughts. If there was one piece of advice to a family who feels overwhelmed and unsure where to start, what would that be?
Every morning, wake up and think, what's most important to me today? Don't get distracted by the other stuff, because what's important to somebody else, what's important to the person who phones up and wants that appointment, or the response to that complaint letter, or even the summary of that appointment that you had 3 weeks ago that you really don't want to read because you were there and you know what it said. Just decide what's important to me today, and go to bed happy if you've done a little bit of that.
Cool. That's nice. That's very simple but very effective. I like that. That's good advice. Lastly, where can listeners find him? You've kind of said that.
I can tell you again.
Where can listeners find more information?
Find us all. So the Skies We're Under podcast is on all your podcasting platforms. So Spotify, Apple, all the usual places. Born at the Right Time, as I said, is it's spelt how you would expect. Born at the Right, W-R-I. No, it's not W, that's my name. So Born at the Right, RAGHT time.com. And you can find out we have parent carer workshops, we have the podcast, we have, like I say, I'm across social media, Born at Right Time, across Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, all the places.
That's great stuff. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today on the Spectrum podcast. It's been great having this conversation with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you very much for listening to us today on the Spectrum podcast. And remember, stay on the spectrum.